So it's wonderful to be here with you today, Steve. Look, you've shone a light on the potential that meetings can have and how much better they could be with your fascinating, distinctive research and your commitment and endeavors. And I take my hat off to you. It's a topic that's close to my heart as somebody who suffered in my previous corporate and consultancy life from bad facilitation, including my own, and participation in long, turgid meetings. Surely there's a better way to do it. You've published a lot, you've spoken a lot, including the Surprising Science of Meetings, which I'm holding up here, as well as your more recent book on, getting it done with one-to-one meetings, which is fantastic. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a total pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. Let me ask a simple question just to get going. But it's a simple question I think we often forget, which is, what are meetings actually here to do? What should they be doing?
So meetings in many ways are an evolution over the command and control systems of the Industrial Revolution, right? Where work used to be accomplished but just by a leader saying, do this, do that, do this. But we evolved. We evolved away from that. We recognized that by engaging people, involving people, gathering their voices as part of an organization, the organization is able to reach new heights, right? They're able to create a workforce that's more committed to the success of the organization, engage in more discretionary behaviors, better customer service, what have you. So ultimately, meetings are indeed an evolution. A world without meetings is much more problematic than the world with meetings. And so when we think about meetings, they are the core way for people to communicate, coordinate, cooperate, have consensus decision-making. And it's also important to recognize that meetings are what humans have been doing since the beginning of time, right?
Yeah,
Humans have gathered. Other animal species gather, right? So gathering is just natural to us. So ultimately, the goal of all my research is not to eliminate meetings, but to eliminate wasted time in meetings.
Yes. So let's just drill down on that a little bit further, which is, let's be clear. So when should we not be using meetings at work?
Sure. Basically, the most simple way of viewing it is that if your task requires engagement from others, then that is a candidate for a meeting, right? If people need to engage with the content in a meaningful way, that's why you have a meeting. If you don't need engagement, then that can be a much more passive communication strategy, right? That could be a podcast, that can be an email. But once you start moving into the need for engagement and interaction, then something else likely needs to happen. And that's where meetings can kick in. That doesn't mean that we want a big fat meeting. We want a lean meeting, right? We want to make sure the right people are there. So that's another kind of perspective.
So assuming you have picked the right people, and that's a skill in its own right, how do you set it up for success? And the reason I ask that is I'm sounding like a sort of self-assessment here, but I've set up meetings where, frankly, the title's been clear. We probably knew, roughly speaking, where we were, but we sort of figured it out. But how do you position it well so people are ready to contribute, ready to come together in the way you eloquently described?
All right. It's a great question. So let me kind of take a half step back, and I think you'll like where I'm going to go. Let's talk a little bit about agendas, right? Because in a sense, that's our purpose. And so the research generally shows that agendas are not related to a meeting effectiveness. And this is often the reason, because what's more important is what's on the agenda. Is it highly compelling? What matters more is how you facilitate completion of that agenda, right? So having a piece of paper with a bunch of topics really doesn't do anything. But there's a twist. And this twist ties into your excellent question. I want to challenge your audience to start structuring their agendas as a set of questions to be answered. By framing your agenda as a set of questions to be answered, now you have to really think about what you're trying to achieve in the meeting, right? It's to answer these questions. By framing your agenda as questions, you know who to invite because they're relevant to the questions. You know if the meeting has been successful and when to end the meeting because the questions have been answered. By framing your agenda items as questions, and this goes even more directly into your question, is you create this engaging challenge for folks. People love answering questions. And so when you start inserting questions into your meeting invites, people can't help themselves. They'll jump in right away. And I'll add that, David, if you just can't think of any questions, that likely means
Yeah.
you shouldn't have a meeting.
Yeah. Pretty
So
obvious.
this approach is not only good for deciding whether you need a meeting, but also motivating the meeting.
I love that. And when developing the questions, how much of it should be done on your own as the chair versus others? And the reason I ask that is in co-creation, co-development is in vogue in many organizations. And sometimes it's very specific, but sometimes it becomes a norm. So is it something you put out there and then have the meeting? Or is it something you try and develop with people in the team that you selected?
I mean, certainly the leader driving it needs to be the biggest lift because they're the ones calling the meeting. But I love the idea of co-creation. I mean, that's the more you can ask others, are there any key questions that you feel like we should be addressing? That's a strong cultural statement.
Cool.
But in general, the manager, if they're calling the meeting and leading the meeting, like they have to have something compelling to do. If they don't have something compelling to do, they need to signal that. Listen, I don't have anything, but if you have something that we can still consider meeting, we just don't want the leader just to get into a meeting habit where they just meet for the sake of meeting. We just always want to make sure that there's an important reason to meet.
Yeah, absolutely. And imagine you're inviting people, you've selected the right people, you framed the right questions, you've encouraged them to contribute, but there's a history of bad meetings in their organization. And so they're thinking, oh, no, not another one. So you've done all those steps, but still there's perhaps a reluctance or you worry about a reluctance. How do you go further so they come ready to, come with positivity and a contribution rather than a sort of perhaps a skepticism that you often see in corporates?
Well, the greatest predictor found in the research of the mood state that exists in a meeting, so your attendee's mood state, is actually your mood state going into the meeting.
Yeah.
There's a contagion effect. So if you start your meeting going, oh, another meeting, right? You're starting with that negative. But if you start it affirmatively, thank you all for coming. I am really glad you're here. We have some important business to cover and you're the right people to do it. And we're going to work on these few questions. We're going to start with the most important question because if we run out of time, it doesn't affect that, right? So these types of statements just get people in the right place, that it's go time. It's getting stuff done time. And I think it's also really interesting to note that, sometimes you have leaders say, oh, I want to have a bunch of kind of getting to know you stuff and things like that at the beginning of meetings. I mean, people are pretty burned out around that, but I'll offer this, that when people have a very productive discussion, they actually like each other more.
Yes.
So sometimes the feelings about the team actually follow success. When you think about sports, right? If you have a football team doing fantastically well, magically people love each other. And when that team is doing really poorly, they stop. And so, if we're trying to build a sense of community, interestingly, we can actually build it through excellent meetings, not necessarily by restructuring our meetings to focus on just socializing.
Yes.
And I think it's an important distinction. So what I tell managers, if they're trying to improve the interpersonal culture of their organizations, meetings are just one small part of that, right? But just going to meetings is not going to make people a better team.
No, absolutely. That's such a great point. So imagine at the beginning of the meeting, you've done everything you've described. You've teed up the questions, you've sort of conveyed your enthusiasm and focus and the outcomes you want to achieve. How do you get it going best? Because sometimes I've been in meetings, you do all of that, and then there's silence. Even if people are positive, they're either waiting for the loudest person to intervene. How do you get a really good conversation, discussion going?
Well, if the questions are compelling and the right people are in the room, you're not getting silence. The silence is actually an indication that you have the wrong people or you don't have compelling questions. But you don't get silence if it's compelling questions and the right people. You just don't. But more directly to your question, leaders have to ultimately recognize that they are a steward of others' time. They called this meeting. They're a steward. And therefore, the thought of people leaving your meeting saying it was a waste of time should be so disconcerting to you that you make sure that this meeting is going to be valuable. So one of the key ways of doing that, besides important questions, is embracing your role as a facilitator. Your job is to help bring out all voices. If you're dominating the conversation, not a very successful meeting, right? In fact, what we found in our research is the more the supervisor talks, the lower the ratings of effectiveness. And You could even transfer that to the world of podcasts, right? If you had a podcast, you bring in guests and you do the majority of the talking, the host, it might not be the best podcast in the world, right? The podcast host is trying to create a meaningful conversation that's telling a compelling story, right? And is engaging their guests. And boy, there's a lot of parallels to running a meeting, right? So if you call a meeting, you're constructing this event and this conversation. So you can think through this, but then your goal is to help facilitate. And the fact is, the more that you talk, the less you're able to facilitate.
Absolutely. He says we're full of self-awareness, given this is a podcast. Let's run through a few scenarios then. So imagine you're in that setting, people are engaging, they're talking, but you as a facilitator think there's perhaps too much conformance, too much groupthink. How do you shake it up most effectively?
Love it. Love it. All right, 2 techniques I'll share. And by the way, I mean, as you know, my books have so many different things. So
yes,
hopefully folks
rich.
will read them. And by the way, before I forget, it's just so important for me to get these books and the science out there. All my profits all get donated to cancer research. So they're not for me.
That's fantastic.
And so just want to, hopefully that might further inspire people to check out the content. So to your question, so a couple things come to mind. So first is that the leader can do a consensus test, right? So we can use a quick poll and see where folks are at. And that's really helpful because sometimes leaders are, well, actually most of the time, we're affected by the loudest voices. And so when we do a poll, then we have a much better sense of where we're at, where there's consensus. But I want to share something even more substantive and exciting and disruptive, which is the use of silence in meetings. Silence in meetings can be one of the most active participation tools a leader can ever do. Boy, that's a crazy sentence, right? But it's true. The research in general shows that if groups brainstorm in silence, typing directly into a document versus brainstorming with their mouths, the silent brainstorming groups yielded nearly twice as many ideas, and those ideas tend to be more innovative and creative. So why is that the case? Well, everyone can talk at once, right? There's not waiting your turn. You're not influenced by that first utterance, especially if it's from the leader, right? So people are just getting their ideas out there, and there's this free-flowing, powerful conversation, and you see people making comments. And when you do things in silence, now you have a record of the conversation. It's pretty fabulous. It's a great technique. But where I'm going with this is silence serves to make sure that all the voices emerge. And that's a beautiful thing to do as a leader.
That touches on another important point, which is many people, particularly from groups that are perhaps minority group or feel marginalized, are interrupted or spoken over. Women, people of color, and other groups. So silence is one thing, using silence effectively. What other things can facilitators do to ensure that people can express their voices without necessarily solving everything for the people involved, which can be quite disempowering?
A leader needs, at the start of the meeting, to clarify their hopes, right? So if that leader says, listen, we're gathered here, everyone here has something important to contribute to this problem. I need to hear from everyone.
Yes.
This meeting is not successful unless I hear from everyone. Okay, that creates a notice. Furthermore, the leader can continue saying, but there's a lot of us here. So let's keep our contributions short, right? We don't want one person dominating this, right? So now you're kind of creating social norms. So let's keep our contributions to 1 minute or less, but let's be sure to listen carefully to what everyone's saying so that we can build off of it. So all those things start to create this foundation of expectations, and that protects your quieter people or your populations that can tend to be more marginalized in meetings. The other neat thing is there's research to suggest that the use of chat in virtual meetings does tend to level the playing field a bit. The less formally powerful people tend to use chat a little bit more readily. So I think that's another thing to make sure that you have into your list of tools. Furthermore, you can actively call on people, right? If people trust you and you've created a sense of safety, you can call on someone and they will see it more as a compliment than trying to catch them. But you have to create a safe environment.
Absolutely. So imagine in the meeting there's been some form of conflict, open conflict, rather than just festering. How do you recover from it? And the reason I ask that is often meetings can get completely derailed, sometimes unprofessional, and you actually just lose the goodness that came before some form of direct conflict. How do you manage conflict? How do you recover from it?
First, let's recognize that conflict in meetings is actually a good thing. We want conflict, but we want conflict of ideas, not of people.
Yes.
And that's another thing that we want leaders to kind of establish up front, that we want you to disagree, but do it respectfully and make it about the ideas, not the person. So what we're trying to manage is not conflict, but how that conflict is resolved. We want it to be resolved constructively, not dysfunctionally or personally. Let's make that our norm. And when there is a conflict and it does start to move to more personal, then the leader can intervene right away and say, hey, let's stop here. This is starting to feel more personal. I want to keep it on the ideas. So let's back up, and they can ask some good questions, right? So it could be, David, tell me more about what is concerning you about the idea that's being presented, right? So the supervisor can intervene, but the leader should not try to eliminate disagreements. We want them.
Absolutely. Going back to a topic you mentioned earlier, Steve, around timings. What's your views on the default timing for meetings? Often meetings, and let me say a bit more, often meetings become that there's certain norms in organizations. Oh, the hour meeting, the half-hour meeting, and so forth. Do you have any particular insights from research or your own experience on what the default should be that you start with?
There shouldn't be a default. That's lazy, right? I mean, there should never be a default. We should make a decision. We do this all the time, right? If we know we have to do particular chores or particular activities, like we schedule our time. We say, oh yeah, this is probably going to take 20 minutes, so I have time to do this after, right? We're not horrible at estimating how long things should be. We just need to do that with meetings. We need to say, okay, here's my agenda. How long should that take? As opposed to just relying on default settings in calendaring programs, especially given something called Parkinson's law. And Parkinson's law is the idea that work expands to fill whatever time is allotted to it. So if a meeting is scheduled for an hour, magically it will take 1 hour. But we can also use this to our advantage, right? If we schedule a meeting for 25 minutes, likely we're going to get it done in 25 minutes.
Absolutely.
So make choices, be assertive with meeting times, because if you need more time, you could always schedule another meeting if necessary. But the fact is, most likely you'll get it done. And people are craving more time. So if you're one of those leaders that say, hey, listen, I'm going to keep this as lean as possible because I respect your needs for time, it only makes you look good.
Absolutely. Gosh, I'd love to work in your organization. We'll come back to that in a minute. Imagine you had that rich discussion. Everyone's had their say. Perhaps there's been a little bit of creative conflict of ideas. How do you know when you've had enough? How do you know when to call time? What are the things that come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, as soon as the conversation starts to spin, where the arguments are no longer fresh or interesting, then you have a choice. You could either say, listen, we've got the issues out, let's move to a kind of a silent vote to see where everyone's at around it. Or another strategy, you can say, listen, we got those issues out, let's just take a pause. We can come back to this at a future date. That's another pure strategy. And interestingly, it's sometimes the case that when you separate ideation from decision-making, you can get better performance. So if meetings are constructed such as one meeting, it's about let's get all the ideas on how to approach this, but we're not going to decide anything. Instead, we're going to ideate, and then next time we'll decide. There is some data to suggest that actually improves performance. There's something about that separation. So that's another potential strategy. You say, okay, good. This is great. We've had a really meaningful conversation. We got these ideas out, and now we'll make some decisions next meeting, and then let people just sit with it, and also, dial back the emotions.
Building on that, I worked with a number of execs who are trying to work out the best model and approach format for their own exec team, their executive committee, leadership team.
Sure.
And they've applied some of these practices. I'm sure they could improve. But the question comes up is not just ideation versus decisions, but is sort of how often should we be making decisions as a team in the meeting? as opposed to the meeting being the vehicle for then the leader to go away in their own time to make their own decisions. Any views or research on that topic?
The only thing that's really relevant is being transparent, right? So what upsets people is when they think you're asking their opinion, but they know you're not really using it. And so it's important just to be transparent, right? So you could say up front, listen, I have to make this decision, but I would love your input and ideas. And then I can take it and I can decide. That's being transparent. Or it could be the case that, no, this is something we can decide together. And you figure that out. And whether you do that, via vote or you do it through conversation and is clear consensus, but just be transparent around it. I think that's totally fine. I think what really upsets people is when managers are just disingenuous.
Yeah, that clarity, transparency, and intentionality, these are themes throughout all of these topics. So you've had that, perhaps in a meeting you have made a decision. How do you get people to follow through? So words don't just become interesting conversation, but actually real action happens.
First, let me tell you about a common mistake that often happens in meetings. And the common mistake is that a meeting ends, but it doesn't have an ending. It ends, but it doesn't have an ending. And with a few minutes left, an ending process needs to start. And this ending process is a recap of what was decided and who's responsible for it and what still needs to be decided. And so there just needs to be a sense of clarity. When a meeting just ends, you often haven't established that sense of clarity or establish that sense of accountability.
Yes.
But with a proper ending, you're able to.
That needs to be planned for and time for. It's often skipped over. So let's get a little bit more personal now yourself. What are you really good at in meetings and what are you working on in terms of the areas you need to improve?
I think I'm intentional. I really try to be a good steward of others' time. I try to be prepared. I certainly try to facilitate and actively generate voices. So I think I'm pretty good at it now. But it would be pretty horrible if I wasn't, right? I mean, I'm writing books about meetings. So I think I'm actually, I get good feedback. I was president of a large organization and ran large board meetings, got good feedback. So I think I'm good at it. Thank goodness. It would be terrible if I wasn't. But I wasn't always. And that's, I think, the important message to your listeners. I was not. It was a journey for me. It was a journey I took seriously and wanted to get better at. When I first started running meetings, my problem area was I would try to avoid disagreements at all costs. I wanted harmony. And my quest for harmony derailed the potential of the meetings. And it prevented people from really battling on key topics. And that was my growth area. I needed to fix that. And so I worked at it. And I just got to the point where I tried to do things to bring out different ideas and feel okay about it. And even though it created tension, I like to call it positive turbulence as opposed to a negative turbulence. And so that was my journey. That was my problem area. So I didn't start good. And I think everyone can get better at meetings if they collect feedback and they care. And again, I'm going to bring it back to you and podcasting. There's a lot of similarities, right? So when you think about excellent podcast hosts, they're prepared, they think about it, they ask good questions, they don't dominate. They are zigging and zagging depending on the conversation. They're weaving a good story. But you don't typically start that way.
Greg, you're practicing what you preach and you have to do the work. You have to do the work. Appreciate your openness. More philosophical question as we come to an end and being respectful and we hope respectful of your time and a steward of the process. What impact are you looking to have on the world around you by your work?
I'm a really big believer that huge problems can be solved by every single human being doing something. That it's the collection of small efforts that can accumulate to address big, vexing, ugly problems. But everyone's got to do something. And because otherwise, the problems are just too big for one person to swing, but everyone can do something. And so my hope is that all my work can be used to be part of the conversation to make each meeting a little bit better. And I'm not expecting all meetings to be perfect, but hopefully this content can be used. And I think that's what's kind of unique about my work. And what I'm so excited that it's gone so viral is it takes a positive perspective. Right? It doesn't take a negative perspective. My book is entitled Meeting Hell or Meetings Suck. My new book is called Glad We Met, right? The art and science of one-on-one meetings, because these meetings can be transformative. And, and we all know that when we have a good meeting, it does feel good. It's energizing and valuable.
Right. Absolutely right.
So I'm just hoping to bring forward science to give people choices, to get people to stop and reflect, and hopefully they'll dedicate to making their meetings better, one meeting at a time.
Fantastic. What a great conversation, stimulating, practical, enriching, and personal. And I love your spirit as well. Where can people find out more about your work, Steve?
Thank you, David. Go to my website. It's stephenrogelberg.com, stephenrogelberg.com. I really have tried to make it a repository of information.
It is fantastic.
Thank you. There's a lot there. And so I hope people will check that out. And then, obviously I'm plugging the books. I think they could really help. And again, I'm donating the profits, my royalties. And so I just hope those things together can give people the tools they need to take a pain point and make it into a positive point.
What a great endeavor, spirit. What a great person. That's a fantastic conversation. That was another edition of Lancefield on the Line. I do hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Please do sign up to the podcast, to the YouTube channel, give us a nice rating. And Steve, thank you ever so much again.
Thank you so much. It was a total pleasure.
Thank you.